My name is Christopher Simpson, and I'm the chair of the Contemplative Consciousness Network. And it really is a pleasure today to welcome you to this online meeting with Lama Alan Wallace. We have people from all over the world, and today's reflection continues a series of webinars with esteemed guest speakers. I see that someone's just raised a hand. If you have any technical questions, I would just invite you to raise those with the CCN host. In the previous events that we've been engaged in this series, we've explored the topics of preventing burnout, formulating a coherent vision for our path, using joy to enrich our lives, and most recently, we've been learning about the figure of Tara. But today, we really are focused on Eco-Dharma. Everywhere we look, we see turbulence, precarity, and it would seem as though instability is prevailing. And today, Lama Alan is going to speak to the following. What can Buddhism offer during an eco-crisis? Our current ecological crises from the perspective of the Four Noble Truths. And to quote the Dalai Lama, destruction of nature and its resources results from ignorance, greed, and lack of respect for the earth's living things. Today, we have access to more information, and it is essential that we re-examine ethically what we have inherited, what we are responsible for, and what we will pass on to the coming generations. So today, Dr. Alan Wallace will use Buddhist analysis of causal interdependence and explore the topic of how cultural and the cultural and mental transformation that we need to undergo if we want to protect and nourish the natural environment. It's rather a challenge to welcome and introduce Lama Alan because the range and scope of practice is so broad and so deep, but I will offer you a brief gloss. So Lama Alan is one of the world's leading scholars, writers, and teachers of Tibetan Buddhism. His work and practice, I would say, model a searching rigor of the highest standards. And today's topic returns him to his initial area of studies in ecology. But moving on from there, there's a rather staggering academic profile which encompasses Buddhist meditation, psychology, philosophy, and crucially, the interface between Buddhism and science. He was ordained by the Dalai Lama in 1975 and lived as a Buddhist monk for 14 years. And since 1987, he's been a frequent translator and contributor to meetings between the Dalai Lama and prominent scientists. Many of you will already have engaged with some of the 40 volumes that he has either written or translated. And along with his scholarly work, Alan Wallace is regarded as one of the West's preeminent meditation teachers and retreat guides. Some of you will know him as the president and founder of the Santa Barbara Institute for Consciousness Studies and also the Center for Contemplative Research. So without further ado, I invite Lama Alan to speak on this very vital issue of Eco-Dharma.
Thank you, Chris, for your very gracious introduction. And also for this opportunity to address this topic, which may be the most important topic that we, humanity in this modern era, can turn our attention to. So we know the title, and we, all of us who are attending to the internet, to the media, we're painfully aware on a daily basis about how we humans, 8 billion of us now, are fouling our own environment, as if we really don't care about our own children, grandchildren, let alone looking ahead to 10 generations beyond. It is quite staggering, actually, that we can be so, to put it bluntly, savagely insensitive and uncaring about our only home, and that is this beautiful earth. When I was first invited to address this topic, of course, I immediately responded in my own heart. Definitely, as Chris just mentioned, from the age of 13 till I was 20, I was planning to devote my whole life to ecology, environmental activism, wildlife biology, wildlife photography, environmental activism. I was a bird watcher. And that was one Dharma that I could really totally embrace, of loving this planet, all of its inhabitants, and doing all we can to protect them, to protect ourselves. But when at the age of 20, I encountered Buddha Dharma, I think I already sensed intuitively that I would find deeper answers, more effective answers to the problems that were already cropping up in the 1960s. Overpopulation, overuse of pesticides, herbicides, overuse of carbon fuels. Scientists way back in the 50s, 60s already saw global climate change was going to be a major problem. But we've done so little in response. And perhaps that's a great enigma, that the evidence is so clear, so overwhelmingly, painfully obvious, and equally obvious that we human beings are responsible for this violation, this catastrophic deterioration of our environment. And yet we're letting our own short-term goals override the long-term welfare of all of humanity and the very possibility of human civilization continuing. So this brings together two major streams of my life. As an environmentalist from the age of 13, when I had a wonderful science teacher, it inspired me in that regard. Meeting His Holiness Dalai Lama in 71 and becoming my root Lama. So I'd like to weave these two together, and it simply struck me as most meaningful to address this topic from the perspective of the Buddha's initial teachings when he went to Saranat and for the first time turned the wheel of Dharma by way of the four realities for Aryas. That's a correct translation. The four realities for Aryas. Aryas, those who have seen the actual nature of reality as it is. And from their perspective, what are the most important, pressing, meaningful realities that we should attend to as sentient beings? And that is, of course, first of all, what we already care about, whether we're religious or not religious, whether we're human or not human. All sentient beings, we care about suffering, we want it to stop. But for it to stop, we have to identify what are its true causes. We need to know that there's at least a possibility of suffering and its causes coming to an end. And then if it is, if that's possible, if it's a good working hypothesis, and then we need to know the means, the path to realize that freedom. And so here we are in the year 2022, almost finished with this year. A very difficult year in so many different ways. Difficult, painful to witness how we humans continue to assault our natural environment, assault each other, assault other species, and with no clear sign that we're slowing down even. So let's turn to an inquiry into these environmental crises by way of the framework of the Buddha himself. First, and very briefly, focusing on simply the reality, the first noble truth, the reality of suffering in this particular case, in this time and place, on this earth at this time. The first reality is the reality of our current ecological crises and the enormous amount of suffering that's already occurring. So I could linger here, but I'm assuming most of you, maybe all of you, are already very well aware of what the problems are as they are manifesting. So I'll just give a couple of brief indicators, markers of what's going on. As a person who, from very early on, had and continue to have a very deep love of nature, of our fellow animals on this planet, about 20 billion of them. The Earth's wildlife populations have plunged by an average of 69%, have gone since 1970, roughly the last 50 years. 69, almost 70% of the world's wildlife has been exterminated by us. And this approaches the largest recorded loss of life on Earth 66 million years ago, when I think many of you know a large asteroid struck in Russia And that resulted in the extinction of 75% of the Earth's wildlife. One asteroid wiped out all the dinosaurs, for example. But we're almost there, and we're rapidly approaching it. We'll probably surpass the 75% marker. Now, what's going on simultaneously with this? I'm going to be very brief because we know. Global climate change resulting in extreme weather patterns, droughts, flooding, wildfires. I'm not going to continue because there's daily press coverage of this and a number of very, very fine documentaries on this topic. So any of us are paying attention. You don't need me to elaborate. But I'm concerned a little bit that we get used to it, especially we in the more affluent countries, the wealthy countries. We like to style ourselves as the developed countries. Because where you live, where I live, we may say hardly any indication of any of this. The wildlife disappearing. I look out the window, I still see birds, but actually not as many as just 10 years ago. And the weather is kind of pleasant here in Santa Barbara. And so for many of us here, especially in the developed countries, the wealthy countries, it can seem like this is somebody else's problem, somebody far away. Those poor countries, Bangladesh, and other countries around the world, countries whose populations are right there, just above sea level. It can look like somebody else's problem. But this is very short-sighted, very narrow-minded. And I'm afraid we've gotten used to the bad news. We're taking it in stride. Certainly our politicians are, and business is. There's no doubt we're doing too little, too late. And we're hastening, if perhaps even at an accelerating speed, to undermining human civilization as we know it. If we continue on this course, human civilization will not look anything like what it does now at the end of this century. And the hundreds of millions of people, possibly billions of people, will perish or suffer from starvation, from drought, from disease. And bear in mind, when things get really tough like this, it often brings out the worst in people: aggression, war. We already know we have weapons of mass destruction that could further decimate life on the planet. And we have politicians who are considering using them. That's why they built them, to use them when they felt the time was ripe. So I won't linger there, but I would simply say, when it came to the first noble truth, the Buddha himself said, this is a reality of suffering. Know it. Understand it. Don't turn away. Don't blink. Don't go out of focus. Don't say, not my problem. Because it may not be your problem today. It will be your problem tomorrow. And next, and the next, and the next generations. It could take thousands of years, maybe longer, if we continue on this trajectory, for the ecosystem to restore its balance. But it may do so better without us. Enough of the reality of suffering. Then we need to move on to, well, okay, what causes it? This human destruction of natural habitats. It's not just global warming. The destruction of natural habitats, the consumption of the Earth's non-renewable natural resources beyond the limits of the planet, and massive, unprecedented pollution of the earth, the soil, the oceans, the lakes and rivers, and the air we breathe. This is why it's happening. If we look further temporally into the origins of the crises that we have manufactured for ourselves and are inflicting on other species, we can trace this ongoing rampant, savage destruction of the ecosphere to its roots in the 16th century, with the rise of European colonialism, imperialism, the century also in which modern science first arose with Copernicus and then Galileo. And also, and I think not coincidentally or irrelevantly, the rise also of the Protestant Reformation, where salvation was considered to be simply an undeserved gift, and the Protestant ethic of working hard, looking outwards, outward progress, all of these went together. Colonialism, imperialism, Protestant Reformation, and then the rise of modern science and technology. So one can trace it at least that far, and of course there are always precedents. But it's especially in the mid-19th century when the increase of human savagery against the environment, other species, and ourselves began to increase dramatically. The mid-19th century, this witnessed the rise of something that had already begun, but now coming very dominantly, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of scientific materialism, the notion that only science provides us with truth. Religions now are displaced. The superstitions of religion are displaced, debunked, made antiquated by science and what is offered instead of Christianity as the worldview in which scientific research is conducted, as was the case for the first 300 years. Since the mid-19th century, the time of Galileo, time of Charles Darwin, Thomas H. Huxley. Scientific materialism now is the worldview in which scientific research is overwhelmingly conducted and taught, disseminated. And with this materialism comes then not only a worldview, a very radically mechanistic, amoral, and reductionistic worldview, but this has a massive impact also on our values. What do we value if we consider death to be termination? Reality is amoral, this great big mindless machine. How does this influence our values? And the values that fit very neatly and very, how to say, in harmony with materialism is the value of hedonism, that our pleasure is to be found outside, by acquiring, by pursuing, by way of wealth, the accrual of wealth, power, status, prestige. That's the way to happiness. And that, of course, has a dramatic and catastrophic influence on humanity's way of life, the accepted way of life. It's worldwide now, and that's consumerism. So there arose simultaneously the Industrial Revolution, the rise of modern science and scientific materialism. But then when science is completely conflated with materialism, it looks like anathema to many, many religious believers that Thomas Huxley himself and many others of his mindset said we should replace all the world's religions with the church scientific. So we should expect that religious believers should then bring forth a backlash. And so in Christianity, it's Christian fundamentalism, which also rose during the mid-19th century. But of course, fundamentalism is not confined to Christianity, but it is the dominant religion still in the West. So we have scientific materialism and its backlash, Christian fundamentalism. And then finally, two other major movements of the mid-19th century that again rose in prominence as that century went on are the rise of capitalism, which had its roots earlier in earlier centuries, but really starts to come to its power in the mid-19th century, and its backlash when people like Karl Marx and saw the savagery, the cruelty that was inflicted upon the proletariat, upon the workers, by the rich and powerful and wealthy elite. Then comes the backlash of communism, and according to Marx himself, its philosophical counterpart, dialectical materialism. So we're back once again to a complete rejection of religion, rejection of any notion that ethics is part of nature. And so these four arose, but dominated by materialism. And one can say, well, wait a minute, those religious fundamentalists, they're deeply religious. They don't accept Karl Marx. They don't accept scientific materialism. They often reject science altogether in favor of their favored religious text, whether it's the Bible, the Quran, and so on. But having known a number of religious fundamentalists over my lifetime, it appears to me that many of them, Christian and otherwise, consider today that their salvation, their redemption, their afterlife is already assured. It's a done deal. They don't have to do anything more, except for now that they have to hold the right beliefs and be good, be obedient. But that opens up a lot of time to pursue happiness in ways outside of religion, namely by materialism and consumerism. So I think many of the most materialistic people on the world, in terms of their actual priorities and actual way of life, are in fact religious fundamentalists. But William James, one of the great pioneers of modern psychology, a great critic of dogmatism altogether, but specifically the dogmatism of scientific materialism, he wrote, and I quote, "The essence of scientific materialism is that matter ends in tragedy." And I think that's what we're seeing right now, here in the 21st century. A materialistic view of reality, the view that we are just matter, we are only animals, the only evidence that counts is physical evidence, and then aligning our priorities, our way of life, with that reductionistic and, frankly, nihilistic view. It ends in tragedy. And we're seeing that play out right now. It's like we're watching a Greek tragedy and we're 1/3 into it, but you already know how it ends. Unless somebody rewrites the script for the rest of this play, it ends in tragedy. These are the causes in terms of our conduct, we human beings. But then why are we behaving in such an irrational, delusional, catastrophically selfish and short-sighted way? Why are we acting against our own well-being and that of our future generations, let alone all of the other species? Why? It's not inexplicable. We shouldn't simply throw our hands up and say, what a mystery. This is where we turn to the Buddha, the Buddha Dhamma. As His Holiness was cited just a few minutes ago by Chris, he mentioned delusion and greed, ignorance and greed. Well, certainly. You know the triad, the three poisons? So the inner causes of these crises, the inner causes of this almost incomprehensibly despicable behavior on our part. I'm not pointing my finger to somebody else. You can see I'm Eurocentric, ethnically myself, of course. But the inner causes are human greed for wealth, individuals, communities, businesses, governments, nations, greed for wealth, thinking somehow if we're just wealthier and wealthier, we'll be happier and happier. Human greed for power, individually, institutions, governments, politicians. The greatest good is getting power and getting more and keeping on to it. Unfortunately, the highest priority for many, many politicians nowadays. Wealth, power, and then prestige, status. The greed for these, the fixation on wealth, power, and prestige as these are true sources of happiness. These are the goals of hedonism. But the scientific fact, there's plenty of evidence, is that there is no corresponding increase of happiness as once one has enough wealth, enough influence, has enough reputation. There is no corresponding increase of happiness with the increase of wealth, power, and prestige. So first of all, greed. And then this is slightly veiled, but not very veiled at all. The second of the two poisons, hatred and aggression. Hatred towards our fellow humans, especially when we have these unprecedented, catastrophic inequalities of wealth, where 8 human beings have the same amount of assets as 3.5 or 4 billion people, the people living on $1 or $2 a day. 8 people have the same assets as the poorer half of humanity. Humanity's never witnessed this before. Inequality of wealth always. To this degree, and not just 8 individuals, but countries who are so wealthy while others are so poor. This is going to give rise to hatred, imperialism, colonialism, often it was suffused by hatred. The themes there, going back to the 16th century, that nature was something to be conquered, subdued, wild animals to be eliminated if they in any way threatened our crops, our livestock, wipe them out, exterminate them. And likewise for any peoples, indigenous peoples around the world, already treating animals as they are of no consequence, then treating human beings as animals. This is hatred. This is aggression. The whole notion of conquering nature is so idiotic, so completely, literally delusional, that wonders how it ever caught on. But it was we in our Eurocentric civilization that came up with this notion of conquering nature, subduing nature. Hatred and aggression arise towards our fellow human beings when there's competition. One group has less, another has more. Hatred and aggression towards other species. If they in any way threaten our well-being, our survival, then we go for total annihilation. And aggression, again, towards nature, conquering nature. There's lots of hatred here. As soon as our desires meet with obstacles, we're not getting what we want, or we get it and somebody threatens to take it away, then hatred comes, and then more suffering comes. And then the root of these two derivative mental afflictions, ignorance and delusion. Ignorance of nature of reality, ignorance of the true causes of happiness, ignorance of the true causes of suffering, and ignorance and then delusion, getting it wrong. And this results in selfishness, in narrow-mindedness, thinking only about our own homes, our own towns, our own communities, our own ethnic group, our own religious community, our own nations, narrow-minded and short-sighted. Now, ecologists have known for as long as there's been ecology that nature knows no borders between countries, no borders between ethnic groups. Economically, now this is very well known, that no country is simply isolated. But we're acting as if selfishness, or the notion that one's own country should be number one, is number one, must remain number one. This is simply psychotic. Let's not give it any lesser a term. But when it comes state policy, national policy, then one of the most vicious diseases of the mind is made acceptable. Selfishness, narrow-mindedness, and short-sightedness. That's why we're in the problem we are right now. And how has it turned out for us, let alone the problems of the eco-crises we've already cited? Despite the exponential growth of wealth for the wealthy countries, and scientific knowledge coming out of the wealthy countries primarily, and technological advances over the past century, according to the World Health Organization, depression is the #1 cause of disability worldwide, and its risk is 32% higher in wealthy countries. And since mid-20th century, in the United States alone, wealth has gone up 50 times. But there's no increase at all in terms of happiness. Zero, flatlined. So the scientific evidence, this is not religious belief or philosophical speculation. The empirical evidence is utterly incontrovertible that what is accepted as normal in terms of worldview, priorities, and way of life is dysfunctional, self-destructive, and catastrophic. And I've watched quite a few documentaries by now, going back to the time of Al Gore, laying out what's the problem. And they show one catastrophic aspect after another of the human abuse, violation of our natural environment, ourselves, other species. And they always end on a high note, but it's not too late. It's not too late. If we turn things around now, they've been saying this for the last 20 years, but are we really listening? Or is it already too late? Well, the sufferings of samsara as a whole, that the Buddha thoroughly understood, when he said, here's the reality of suffering, know it. And then he turned to the investigation and the discovery of the inner causes of suffering throughout all worlds, as greed, hatred, and delusion. And of course, we're born with them. They are connate, they're instinctive. Nevertheless, the Buddha himself found that we can be free from these root, connate, or inborn mental afflictions that give rise to all evil that humans perpetuate on ourselves, the environment, other species. But now bringing this into the 21st century, freedom, can we overcome these crises? Can we face them, survive, and even flourish? And if the Buddha was optimistic enough to say that suffering as a whole can be overcome irreversibly, then we must also take as a working hypothesis that freedom, overcoming, rising to the challenge, can be done by freeing ourselves from these current versions of delusion and craving and hostility, namely by freeing humanity from materialistic worldview, hedonistic values, and consumer-driven behavior that are causing these crises, and they all stem from greed, hatred, and delusion. So the Buddha's diagnosis, having achieved perfect awakening of a Buddha, of the root of all suffering in samsara, in all realms of existence, has practical application. I think the diagnosis is exactly right. It comes down to greed, hatred, and delusion. But how can we enact this if we've now, as we come to the second noble truth, the second reality for Aryas, here is the origin of suffering, abandon it, eliminate it, said the Buddha. Here is the possibility of freedom, the reality of freedom, realize it, said the Buddha, as he went through the Four Noble Truths. How can we actualize, realize freedom? Only, I would suggest, by global cooperation, by individuals, institutions, and nations, all of us uniting under a common cause, a common threat, common enemy. But the enemy is not the rich, it's not this government or that industry or this business or that ethnic group or this religion. The common enemy of humanity right now is killing us, destroying our way of life, sacrificing our own children on the altar of our own greed, hatred, and delusion. The common enemy is our own mental afflictions and the resultant destructive behavior. So we need to go deep, but look where solutions have already been found. Then we turn to the fourth noble truth in this regard. The fourth reality for Aryas, the way to freedom from such suffering and its causes. The suffering that traces back to the 16th century and rising with a massive, deafening crescendo in the 19th century, accentuating, growing exponentially in the 20th century, where we learn more in the 20th century, scientifically, than all the preceding centuries combined. Technology grew like never before in the 20th century. And yet the worst, most destructive world wars, the First World War, 20 million dead, Second World War, 18 million dead, and the violation of other species, the extinction of species, desecration of the environment. How could we know so much and have so much technological power? And yet has any of that knowledge helped us as a species to diminish our mental afflictions, to be less selfish, less greedy, less arrogant, less cruel, less unethical? Has any of this knowledge made us more compassionate, more nonviolent? Or have we simply used our science and technology as means of our own self-destruction? There is a way. The Buddha said, here's the fourth noble truth. Practice it. Follow it. What would this have to entail? It would have to entail cultivating an authentic view of reality. We're out of our minds. We're out of touch with reality, with materialism, hedonism, and consumerism. We're still betting on it. Governments are still betting on it. that we're doing well when the gross national product is, or domestic product is increasing. The economies, people running the economy start freaking out when the consumer index goes lower. People running the show are insane. And we still vote them into office. Or they are dictators and they run with tyranny. This is the great irony of communism, that it became basically national capitalism, where the government owns everything, as in under Stalin and many other communist dictators, and they rule with fear and tyranny. They all do. So much for the proletariat. You take them out of the pot and put them in the fire. To follow the path to freedom, we must cultivate an authentic view of reality and our environment that recognizes the interdependence of all sentient beings amongst ourselves and with the inanimate world. We've lost sight of this. We've lost sight of this. Individuals, companies, nations. We feel that we can inflict harm on others, other nations, other people, animals, the environment. And to use a phrase from English, get off scot-free. I checked out the origin of this phrase. Oh, he got off scot-free. It has nothing to do with Scots, the Scottish people, I'm happy to say. It goes back to the Norse phrase, Norse from Scandinavia. Norse phrase 1,000 years ago, skatt-free, and skatt turns into scot, was a tax that the wealthier people needed to pay to take care of poor people. But if a person managed to be very clever and be a tax dodger and not pay that tax because they wanted to keep their own wealth for themselves and increase it, then they were said they got off scot-free or scot-free. And that's exactly what the wealthy nations now are betting on. The great, powerful, multinational companies often pay very little in the way of taxes. And their working hypothesis, they can get off scot-free. The wealthier nations, as poorer nations, are pleading with the wealthier nations, as they're going under right now because of global climate change, the desecration of the environment, and they're asking the wealthy countries, please help us financially, because we're bearing the brunt of this environment destruction that you, the wealthier countries, have inflicted on the planet. And the wealthier countries say, well, we'll give you some pocket change, but we think we're going to get off scot-free. And of course, the notion that each of us simply dies and is exterminated, terminated, ceased at death. This is, of course, the fundamental article of faith of materialism. The third noble truth, extinction of suffering, the cause of suffering, all you have to do is die. So easy. And then you get off scot-free. Whatever you've done, you could be the most dishonest, exploitative, corrupt, savage businessman or government. But when you die, then you're off scot-free. That's the belief, that's the hope of materialists. That whatever you've done, there'll be no consequences for you. Too bad, it's for the other people, and they will have to pay the price. The Buddha Dhamma says, that's blind faith. I've been reflecting on this just recently. The cessation of individual consciousness at death, which is an unquestioned article of faith for materialists, but it saturates the media, saturates education, saturates government policy. You have only one life to live, and then it's lights out. That's called being realistic. That is complete nonsense, false propaganda. The cessation of consciousness at death is unknowable in principle. Because if it's true, by the time your consciousness has ceased, it's actually happened, you won't be there to know it. So you'll never know it. You'll be conscious, and then not conscious, but you'll not know that you're not conscious. And so it's unknowable in principle. And consciousness has never been detected objectively, hasn't been defined. Its presence or absence has never been objectively measured. So the presence or absence of consciousness, its possible termination at death, is unknowable in principle, from objective measures for the simple reason it's not physical. Therefore, the cessation of consciousness at death is unknowable in principle, and therefore there is no empirical grounds or rational grounds for saying it's true. And so many people have blind faith, that assurance, well, at least when I die, all my problems would be finished. Then it's your problems. Dream on. Nobody gets off scot-free. That's the real truth. It's an unpleasant truth. It's an inconvenient truth. It's an unwanted truth. It's a horrific truth. Nobody gets off scot-free. Nobody. No individual, no community, no nation. You may think you can get away with it. You're wrong. That's just the truth. We exist in interdependence with all sentient beings. And the most effective demolition of the scientific worldview, of the scientific materialist worldview, that everything just boils down to matter, space, time, matter, energy, in some objective world out there, this is being more and more compellingly, devastatingly refuted by the people who know most about the physical universe, most about matter. Physicists. And among physicists, go to quantum physics. They're the ones, quantum physicists, since the time of Max Planck 122 years ago, they have probed most deeply into the nature of matter. Matter, energy, space, time. And one of the leading physicists of the modern era, a protege of Stephen Hawking, a physicist named Thomas Hertog, writes, leading theoretical physicist, he says, you can think of that quantum reality a bit like a tree. The branches represent all possible universes. In our observations, we are part of the universe, so we are part of that tree. Our observations select certain branches and hereby give meaning or give reality to our past. In a quantum world, quantum theory indicates that we may not be mere chemical scum. The article of faith, the sheer groundless conjecture of materialists with no supporting evidence. And he concludes, life and the cosmos are, in the quantum theory, a synthesis, and our observations now give, in fact, reality to its earliest days. This is a theme that's coming more and more prominent in cutting-edge theoretical physics. The very notion that there is space-time out there objectively real is being compellingly refuted. The very existence of matter and energy being objectively, inherently real, refuted. The notion that we are simply chemical scum, that consciousness just pops out of chemicals, like the genie out of a lamp, this hysterically ridiculous superstition, pawned off on us as science, is being refuted by science itself. But the media is largely ignoring this. The media goes where the money is, and that's where materialism is. A final quote from a contemporary physicist, Christopher Fuchs. It's not that the world is built up from stuff on the outside, as the Greeks would have had it, nor is it built up from stuff on the inside, as the idealists like George Berkeley and Eddington would have it. Rather, the stuff of the world is in the character of what each of us encounters every living moment, stuff that is neither inside nor outside, but prior to the very cut, the very notion of a cut between the two at all. So this calls for a fundamental, utterly radical view of the nature of the universe as a whole, nature of mind, nature of human existence, and our role in nature, because we've gotten it terribly, catastrophically wrong, and we're paying the price. In terms of our priorities, as Buddhist teachers so commonly remind us, we all want to be free of suffering, find happiness. And as Shantideva points out, while we wish to be free of suffering, we hasten after its causes. While we wish to find happiness, we destroy the very causes of our own happiness as if it were our foe. It can only give rise to compassion. This is exactly what we're doing as a human species. To find a way to freedom, we must uncover ancient wisdom of the West and the East, of wisdom traditions, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Zhuangzi, Shankara, Buddha, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Jesus himself, the Quran, the Taoist tradition, the Jewish tradition, all of the great religions of the world have all drawn a distinction between two types of happiness. It goes by different names, of course, but we can call them mundane pleasure, something we acquire from the world by means of wealth, power, and prestige, sensual pleasure, intellectual pleasure. Distinction between mundane pleasure and genuine well-being. If we are to find a path out of the misery we created for ourselves, we must know the difference between these two. The Greeks called it hedonia and eudaimonia. We must know the causes of each. What are the causes of mundane pleasure? Obvious. What are the causes of genuine well-being? Not so obvious. What are the limitations of mundane pleasure? Its pursuit, fixation on mundane pleasure. That's the whole meaning of life. Never satisfies, gives rise to conflict, ends in tragedy. And what are the benefits of genuine well-being? The benefits of prioritizing genuine well-being over hedonic pleasure. The benefits of cultivating inner peace and mental balance over the pleasures of acquisition, power, prestige, and so on. Very simply, briefly put, mundane pleasure, which again, the great wisdom traditions, many philosophies, and nowadays modern psychology are drawing this distinction between mundane pleasures that derive from what we can get from the world. We pursue it, we run after it, we try to get it, we try to hold on to it once we've got it. And the chief strategies for acquiring it are wealth, power, and status. In contrast, and it's not sustainable, and it is competitive, it does give rise to catastrophic inequalities, which gives rise to war, let alone the depletion, the destruction of the whole environment. Taking that as number one priority is absolutely delusional and destructive. In contrast to genuine well-being, it's derived from what we bring to the world, something that we cultivate, do not pursue. Genuine well-being that is sustainable, that is satisfying, that is not competitive. The cultivation of genuine well-being from one individual to the next, from one culture to the next, one nation to the next, has never been cause of war, ever. It's always a pursuit of hedonia. Who has more wealth? Who has more power? Who has more status? Genuine well-being comes from what we bring to the world by way of our way of life, by leading the very essence of an ethical life. Nonviolence. Nonviolence towards each other. Nonviolence towards all sentient beings. Nonviolence toward the environment, our natural environment, our home, Mother Earth. That we need to stop violating our own mother. Nonviolence. Ethics, nonviolence, and when we have an opportunity to do some good, to help out, to be of service. Benevolence. So there are clearly many ethical traditions, systems, sets of laws, from one religion to the next, one philosophy to the next, one economic system to the next. But common ground among all legitimate ethical traditions: nonviolence, benevolence, or compassion. We can cultivate genuine well-being by cultivating an ethical way of life. And that's in our interrelationship with other beings and with the environment. But we also exist as individuals, quietly alone in our own chambers, time just for being with ourselves, by ourselves. And in such solitude and simplicity, when we're not out foraging for more pleasures, more stimulation, more acquisition, but we sit quietly in our chambers, then we can see for ourselves Are we content? Are we happy? Are we agitated? Are we calm? To what extent are mental afflictions arising when there's nothing outwardly stimulating them? And in solitude, when we're not caught up in work, entertainment, social engagements, responsibilities, duties, but just have time to be an individual in the universe. We can look inwards and see, how balanced is my mind? How sane am I? And recognize the source of my discontent, unhappiness, depression, anxiety, insomnia, ADHD, PTSD, borderline personality disorder. What are problems we identify? We're all coming from our own minds. Don't look outwards. Don't look outwards. You're looking in the wrong direction. Don't look to your brain. The brain has been blamed for mental diseases. Well, and one more completely superstitious, delusional view that somehow got the veneer of science, that all mental problems are simply brain dysfunctions. This has been categorically, unequivocally disproven by a wealth of empirical evidence, and yet people are still profiting massively, billions of dollars, by selling drugs on the premise that, oh, this is medicine, psychoactive drugs. It's all false propaganda. There's not one drug that cures one mental disease. They're conflating the symptoms with the actual underlying problems of the mind, the afflictions of the mind. If you want to find genuine well-being, you need to cultivate your mind, not take drugs or just exercise more or find another environment. Cultivating mental balance, cultivating wisdom, insight. And so as the Buddha himself addressed and elaborated on 3 kinds of genuine well-being. Well-being arising from a clear conscience and contentment, well-being arising from an ethical way of life, and being satisfied with with enough for yourself, your family, the people who depend upon you. Do you have enough wealth? Do you have enough influence? Or are you subjugated, bullied, tyrannized by others? Do you have enough status, enough reputation, that again, you're not abused or exploited by others? Well-being arising from a clear conscience, knowing that we're living an ethical way of life, and contentment with enough wealth, enough influence, enough of a good reputation, and being content. On that basis of ethics, the first of the 3 higher trainings, there's a deeper and even more sustainable dimension of well-being that arises through the cultivation of samadhi, which literally means unification of the mind. And it refers to the cultivation of exceptional degrees of mental health and balance, and the unification of the mind, in contrast to its being fragmented, multitasking itself to death. A deeper well-being arising from cultivating exceptional mental balance and health. And finally, the supreme well-being the Buddha spoke of as the well-being of complete freedom through insight, especially insight into our own nature and our relationship with the world around us. If we 8 billion people prioritized the cultivation of genuine well-being over the pursuit of mundane pleasures, we could save the planet, we could save ourselves, we could rescue other species that we're decimating. It is that simple. And you don't need to be religious. You don't need to believe in God or karma. But you do need to know that actions have consequences, and many of them are far-reaching, beyond the context of this life. How shall we proceed as we look ahead? Science and technology from the time of Galileo have brought great benefits for us. Communication, prosperity, food, medical health, medical care. There's no doubt about that. We're having this conversation right now with something like 500 people. Why? Because by means of technology, we're clairvoyant and clairaudient. It's wonderful. But also we have misused our knowledge and our power. in ways that are catastrophic, and it has to stop. So we need to apply the full strength of science and technology to solve the problems that have been created in part by the misuse of science and technology, which is knowledge and power. To be a bit more specific, if we are to survive and flourish, and not just make it through to the end of the century, with a very large percentage of the human population sacrificed, let alone other species, then there has to be radical change. There has to be radical change in how we educate the younger generations. If we are to survive and flourish, and not simply eke out an existence in a dark age that could continue for centuries to come, because of our misconduct over the last 150 years, or last 400 years, then education, which now is focused overwhelmingly simply on success. Global education and the media, government policy, business policy, must emphasize the importance of cultivating a nonviolent, benevolent behavior toward our fellow human beings, other species, and the natural environment. This needs to be taught in every kindergarten on the planet. Whatever the government's policy, whether it's communist or capitalist, whether it's a dictatorship or a democracy, whether it's religious or anti-religious, we have to face the common enemy. And it's none of the above. It's not the non-religious or the tyrannical governments. No, we have to go deeper than that. We have to go deeper than that and recognize we, across the board, but especially in the wealthy countries, we are the ones, we are the criminals. And we need to teach and practice the importance of cultivating nonviolent, benevolent behavior. We need to be informing everyone of the scientific evidence, empirical evidence, first person and third person evidence. What are the true causes of mental distress? And let's stop this obscene superstition, illegitimately bearing a scientific aura to it, that the causes of mental distress are biological in nature, or that they're outside. Other people, your environment, your parents, your past. Can we just stop it? The source of our problems is not outside, nor is it outside in here in the brain. It's in our minds. And the causes of happiness are not outside. They're in our minds. And what specifically we need to understand, we need to identify, and eliminate the inner causes of distress and cultivate the causes of genuine well-being. And we need to teach children all over the world, children from elementary school up to old age, people who are still childish. We, all of us, need to learn how to prioritize the cultivation of genuine well-being over mundane pleasure. Mundane pleasure, the pursuit of it, gives rise to inequalities and to violence and destruction. Cultivation of genuine well-being gives rise to peace, flourishing, not competitive. We need to be teaching effective methods for cultivating mental balance and well-being. They're available in our sixfold matrix of mental balance, where we have more than 40 scientists, educators around the world working on this initiative. There are very clear methods for developing 6 types of mental balance. We also need to emphasize in education, the media, the nature of actions, individual and collective, and their consequences in the natural world. To my mind, it's simply a painfully obvious fact that consciousness does not, individual consciousness does not terminate at death. As much as many people are betting their lives on it and hoping, well, at least when I die, my problems are over. Hoping in vain. That's not scientific, not even rational. The notion that consciousness comes out of chemicals, this is voodoo chemistry. There's no branch of physics that allows for that, for non-physical phenomena to emerge from physical, for non-physical epiphenomena to arise from physical, for non-physical functions of physical entities. There's no place for that in modern science. It's voodoo physics, voodoo chemistry, voodoo biology. It's superstition with no basis in empirical fact at all. But the marketing has been fantastic, fantastically destructive, catastrophically misleading. Our actions have consequences for future generations on this planet. And whether we like it or not, the reality is our actions have consequences for us beyond this life. It's true. Doubt it if you like. Bet your life on it, but we're all betting our lives. Virtually all of us are betting our lives on something we don't know. I am completely convinced there are people who do know what happens at death because they've moved through the dying process lucidly. From the beginning of dying to the culmination of dying, lucid all the way through, lucid after the body, brain are dead, lucid in this transitional phase thereafter, all the way through, and come to report it on the other end. What happens at death is not by nature unknowable. It has been known, can be known. But this should be brought into the context of science and not relegated to the garbage dump of religious belief that so many people don't take seriously. Our actions have consequences. For all of us as a species, this was perhaps the most important insight the Buddha shared with us. Not many of us are really focused on achieving liberation from samsara. But if we're using our human intelligence, then we must be concerned about our long-term well-being and not just within the very short parameters of human life. Wake up. Wake up. There is no easy escape from reality. There is no escape from reality at all. The only choice is, do you want to perpetuate the cycle of suffering or do you want to follow a way out? That's the only choice we have. But saying, I don't want to play, I don't want to pay it, I'm done, I don't believe any of that stuff, I want out. Well, you can also believe that gravity doesn't exist. But when you step over a cliff, you'll find out you're wrong. And when you step over the cliff of death, you're going to find out you're wrong. What we need here for such a shift in education, media, government policy, there needs to be an unprecedented and first revolution in the mind sciences, questioning and discarding so many of the underlying reductionistic articles of faith that have blinded the mind sciences for 150 years. But there's also hope in the great contemplative traditions of the world, East and West. Each of them is a treasure house of insights, methods for fathoming the causes of genuine well-being, the inner causes of distress, and finding freedom. There needs to be a renaissance in contemplative inquiry around the world. We are so ignorant about the nature of mind, while at the same time we know so much about what appears to be the external universe. We do need to fathom the mind in order to heal the world. So I'll end on a brief quote by the very famous cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead. And she states here, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. We are a small group of people on this call, 500 people or so versus 8 billion. That's a minuscule, tiny, tiny group. But we are thoughtful. And I think the vast majority, perhaps all of us listening right now, are committed. But now I speak specifically to the people on this call. We have tremendous responsibility because we have been given so much in terms of Dharma by great teachers. If compared to any of the great masters of the past, Shantideva, Atisha, Nagarjuna, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and other great beings of the recent era are of the same status. there are great beings. Will such a shift in global education, media, government policy, will it take place? Will it be enough in time? Will we avert the utter destruction of human civilization as we know it? And so damage the environment, it will take maybe hundreds or thousands of years to recover from our human assault on our own home? If I speak to you very candidly, I would say, if we continue with what we're doing right now, the answer is no. It's so clear. We're not doing enough, and we're doing it too late. But we who have encountered such deep Dharma, there's nothing exclusivist about this at all. But I do have some awareness of the tremendous depth of insight, benefit, for fathoming the resources, the inner resources of the mind. We have it within hand's reach. To become great. Not that our egos will become great, but that our egos will vanish. And a power that transcends any of us individually can arise through us. In Buddhism, we can call it Buddha nature, pristine awareness, primordial consciousness, the Buddha within. I do believe that if those of us who've been so privileged to know of ultimate relic bodhicitta, the Lojong, the four immeasurables, the power of samadhi, the power of wisdom, the power of identifying and dwelling in pristine awareness, the potential for bringing forth a whole array, a spectrum of modes of extrasensory perception and cities, all flowing from this ultimate source of Buddha nature. If there were a small group of individuals who are as privileged as we are and make full use with absolute, complete, uncompromising dedication to Dharma, we have the ability to become viras and viras, true heroes and heroines. We could save the world. A small group of people, speaking now Buddhist to Buddhist, to reach the Mahayana path, to identify Rigpa, to proceed along the path of the great perfection, which in principle is open to people of all faiths, as Gyatso Rinpoche taught, about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, in the 1990s, when he taught natural liberation that presents the whole path of Dzogchen, including Tekchö and Trötgel, and he invited anyone, Buddhist or non-Buddhist, anyone is welcome to attend if you wish to put these teachings into practice. Dzogchen is potentially for everyone. We have the potential to become Vidyadharas, and even a small group of Vidyadharas could change the world, heal the world. So we've been received so much, and it's our responsibility to fully embrace and embody what we've learned, and then be of greatest possible service to heal the world. I don't believe that great numbers of people, 8 billion, 4 billion, 2 billion, I don't think they will do it. The inertia is too great. But a very small group of people, I believe, could save the whole world. So please reflect on this. What is your highest priority? What is the greatest service you can offer to the world? And devote yourself to that. So that's what I'd like to offer for now. Maybe there's some time for discussion.
Thank you so much, Lama Alan, for this cogent presentation. And there's so much to consider in what you've said. And I would just like to invite people to place in the Q&A at the bottom panel of your screen within the Zoom window, you will notice there's a Q&A section. And we would just like to invite you to place any questions in the chat there in the Q&A section. And just a couple of thoughts. Please make sure that they are absolutely pertinent to the topic in hand. And please write them in English and also make them as concise as you possibly can. Lama, there is one very pertinent question which has been asked by Sarah Deakin, and I think it speaks to this concern about the relationship between the inner world and the outer world, this notion of mental hygiene and manifestation in the outer world. So I'm going to read it to you, and perhaps you could reflect a little bit on that. So this is from Sarah Deakin, who asks, I have spent the last few years working on climate mitigation. Is it more beneficial for me to leave this and focus on my meditation practice? If so, who will do this environment work with the compassion that is necessary?
Thank you. Wonderfully pertinent question. And of course, you know my decision when I was 20 to disengage from the whole course of education I was following to become an environmentalist, and went off instead with a one-way ticket to India to study Dharma. But the answer to the question, of course, can only be authentically answered by each of us individually. If we looked for the reality of the path to freedom, it has to include everything. We can't say, well, let's just all go into retreat. 8 billion people now go into retreat, bring your kids. Not going to happen. We need everything. We need global activists for global climate change. We need activists working in sustainable energy. We need activists to overcome the decimation of natural habitat. We need activists in science, technology, education, government policy, and so on. We need all of that. There's no one group that's going to heal the world. But then we can ask individually, and I'm not going to answer the question for you, but we can ask, what opportunities do we have that hardly anybody else has? What can we contribute that hardly anybody else can contribute? We need medical doctors, we need biologists, we need engineers, we need technologists, and so forth and so on. But there are tens of thousands of them. So let's not ask the question, oh, well, if I went into retreat, then what would happen if everybody went into retreat? Let's not ask silly questions. It's a waste of time. Nobody is suggesting everybody should go into retreat, and it's ridiculous to think that everybody will. That's absurd. Any more than everybody's going to become an environmental activist. Everybody's going to be working in solar energy. Everybody's going to be working in preserving natural habitat. But we need everybody following their own heart, finding what is their higher priority. But I do suggest that when we make our decision, we ask individually, each of us with our own unique background, what can I offer that perhaps no one else can? And do that. And so look at the knowledge, the understanding that you've acquired, and highlight that which is most important and follow that. And it's not for me to tell you what that is. Maybe it is to become an activist for global climate change or restoring the balance of climate. Not for me to say we need everyone. But as a person who's dedicated the last 52 years of my life really only to Dharma, then I know for myself, with a completely clear conscience, I'm going to be stepping back in about 2 weeks and disappearing, and for a while be explicitly, in terms of observables, completely irrelevant and useless to the environment. I'm going to be living alone, eating a very modest amount of food, and meditating many hours a day. So I won't be teaching, I won't be translating, I won't be writing, I won't be responding to emails. But I feel this is the greatest service I can offer. And I'm not putting a time limit on it. The greatest service I can offer for 3 months? No, I'm not going to say 3 months or 6 months. I will be asking myself repeatedly in solitude, today, this week, this month, wherein lies the greatest benefit for this individual to offer to the world? Shall I remain in solitude longer? Or would there be greater benefit from my coming out? And as soon as the answer is once and then consistently come out, that's when I'm going to come out. But not out of a different motivation, out of the same motivation that draws me into solitude. I want to offer the very best I can. But for me to offer the best I can, I must be the best I can. It's the great beings of the world, the Buddha himself, Zhuangzi, Jesus, great beings. More recently, Mahatma Gandhi. In America, Martin Luther King. It's the great beings, His Holiness Dalai Lama. It's the great beings that change history. I think we have a responsibility to do all we can to become great beings. And even a small number could change the whole world. Whereas billions and billions of people who are just getting by and chipping in, I don't think it's going to be enough. That's my answer.
Thank you. So we have another question from an unnamed attendee, anonymous attendee. And this question begins, the Buddha Dharma seems to teach that experiencing environmental problems is primarily the karmic ripening of harmful actions, such as sexual misconduct, idle speech, and wrong views, among others. This karmic ripening may occur many lifetimes after the original action. And the question is, can you comment on whether and how this ties in with your take on environmental destruction?
Very good. First of all, that's a misunderstanding of karma. Anybody who says, oh, global climate change, decimation of wildlife, pollution, oh, it's our bad karma. What did we do in past lives? Oh, gosh, what was it? Well, what can we do after all? And they're basically going to fate and destiny. Oh, what was it we did in a past life? This is complete nonsense. If a person eats junk food year after year, doesn't exercise, maybe smokes heavily, and then gets to middle age and is obese and has one physical problem after another, and then throws up his hands, oh, must be my karma that I have such bad health. This is complete nonsense. You're in bad health because you didn't take care of your health. You didn't exercise. You ate junk food. You smoked. This isn't past karma. This is what you did in this lifetime, and you're getting the consequences in this lifetime. Other species, the 20 billion animals, they didn't do anything to cause the destruction of their species, the decimation of the environment. For them, we say it has their karma. For our children born into this world, who are still innocent, they're 4 years old, 5, 10 years old, they're innocent. Whatever suffering they're getting is from their past karma. But who catalyzed this karma? We did. So in a theistic context, His Holiness was asked once, shall we pray to God, to deliver us from the evils of global climate change and drought and famine and so forth? Shall we pray to God? Help us, O Lord. And the Dalai Lama said, God didn't create these problems. Don't ask him to fix it. Karma, past life karma, didn't create global climate change. We did it. Our parents did it, grandparents, great-grandparents. They did it. And so let's not mix up karma that may go over many, many lifetimes to consequences for which we can trace the causes in recorded history. This is action and its consequences, but nobody has to believe in karma and reincarnation to connect the dots, to see this is the cause and this is the consequence. That's why I went back to the 16th century and then the explosion of the problems in the 19th century and the accentuation of the problems that we are perpetuating through the 20th and 21st century. Let's not go to karma. Karma in terms of actions and consequences, yes, but this is not contingent on any belief in reincarnation and consequences of our deeds in future lifetimes. I don't discount that for a moment. I'm utterly convinced it's true. But this is action and consequences in observable reality. And that we have to take responsibility for.
Thank you. We have another question here from Ferrand Ponnet. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. And this opens, we have known for decades that ignorance is the source of the destruction of nature. When we combine spiritual and ecological teaching to people, they focus on solving psychological or problems of happiness. Decision makers mostly do not go to teaching. Spiritual teaching and environmental conscience are usually unleashed. What to convey and how to convey this awareness for the benefit of life. And perhaps we can sort of consider that in the broader context of governmental institutions or organizations at large, how to transmit.
I'm sorry to say that I believe most of what you said is true. The decision makers, heads of large countries, but also smaller countries, they're the decision makers, heads of very large corporations, heads of the companies in the oil industry. They're making big decisions. There are countries whose economy depends on the sale of fossil fuels. And so there are countries and industries that are lobbying right now, the decision makers with a lot of influence, that we burn more fossil fuels so that they can make profit in the short term. And if it leads to the destruction of the natural environment over the next 100 years, that's the other person's problem, so they think, feeling they're going to get off scot-free. For those of us who are in democracies, and we actually are voting in people who are making the decisions, then they get into power because we place them there. We can get them out of power by removing them and not voting for them. We need political activists, environmental activists. We need monitoring a government to have a role in a civil servant, as a civil servant in the United States. You're working for the postal or social work and so forth and so on. You have to fulfill certain criteria. Are you qualified? Are you licensed? Are you mentally sound? But in our very strange government in the United States, as we've seen, people with no qualifications whatsoever can be voted into the highest office. Governor of the state of California, President of the United States, with no qualifications whatsoever. This is democracy that's running aground. And so, to my mind, in a sane government, people would be put into office with a criterion that are mentally sound, mentally balanced. And that's not the case now. And so we are the proletariat, we are the people. And even if we're, for those living in dictatorships, governments that rule by tyranny, by fear, by terrorizing their own people, and doing their best to terrorize other countries and other people, there are plenty of them, we know who they are. They're in power because the people let them remain in power. But people overthrow governments when the governments are unjust, cruel, self-serving, and tyrannize their own people. We need revolutions on multiple fronts, that we're governed by people who will care for us, who put the well-being of the populace above their own well-being. And when we're not governed by such people, we should do all we can to displace them from power, peacefully, because violence begets violence, hatred begets hatred. As His Holiness the Buddha, as the Buddha himself said, enmity or malice is never overcome with malice. Malice is overcome only with loving kindness. So identify who the decision makers are, and if they're making bad decisions, decide to do all you can to remove them from power. Because one person in power who is delusional, who's malevolent, who's cruel, can also bring about great change. As one person in power who's benevolent, wise, and kind can bring about great change. We need to do all we can to see that those who are the decision makers are making decisions for the benefit of all and not just for their own individual gratification, for the sacrifice of all. And that's happened way too many times. We have to take a responsibility for allowing the people who govern us to continue governing us. If we don't, who will?
Thank you, Lama. So we have perhaps a final question from Matteo as we draw to a close. And Matteo brings us into a question around practical recommendations. So he says, thanks for the bottom of my heart, Lama Alan, I love you. And he asks, for people living in the consumer-based lifestyle that our global system proposes, apart from abandoning activities that damage our environment, causes of suffering, what are practical recommendations on ways to contribute to the regeneration of the natural environment?
The knowledge is there in plain sight. It's been disseminated by countless times by knowledgeable people who have studied the problem and know what we need to do in terms of consumerism, of transportation, making a livelihood, the food we eat, and so forth. There's lots and lots of good advice out there. And very few people are following it. But nevertheless, this is where activism comes in. Activism by hundreds of thousands of people. We see that even under a tyrannical, vicious government, when people rise up and protest, even the most tyrannical, despotic governments will see that their own power is being put in jeopardy, and so they'll do something. Out of benevolence, maybe. Out of maintaining their own power, for sure. So the advice out there, I have nothing to add because I'm not an expert in these fields, but the knowledge is all out there. What we as 8 billion people can do to minimize our destructive impact on the environment by the food we eat, by the standard of living that we follow. But overall, if we 8 billion people, if we'd be satisfied to have enough wealth that we can take care of our dependents, people who rely upon us, enough, so we have no anxiety. Have enough influence that we're not subjugated, bullied, tyrannized, or exploited by other people. We have enough self-determination. And enough status that we're not looked down upon, despised, exploited, treated inhumanly. If we have enough of these three, wealth, power, and status, enough, then the Buddha himself said, if you'd like to really taste the ground floor, the foundation of genuine well-being, live an ethical way of life and go for contentment. And then if 8 billion people of us did that, then these unspeakable inequalities of wealth and power, unprecedented in all of human history, these would vanish. And there would be enough for all. We have 8 billion people on the planet now. And right now, the earth is large enough. The natural resources, the food, potential food, is enough to support all of us, to have enough. And I've read of people who are experts in population. Our earth, which isn't getting any bigger, same size, natural resources diminishing. If we were wise and content with having enough, the earth could actually support 11 billion. Beyond that, we may have simply outgrown the planet. And the planet then, without anthropomorphizing planet Earth, will bring out its antibodies and treat us like a disease. And we human beings will be the disease from which the Earth needs to cure itself. We don't want to be the disease. We're the most intelligent beings on the planet, by far. So why should we act as if we're a disease? a cancerous growth, destroying our host. But if we go too far, then even apart from the ways we destroy ourselves with weapons of mass destruction and so forth, the ecosphere will give rise to results that will limit the damage inflicted by us. But the sad part of this for us is this will entail inconceivable, unimaginable suffering for human beings. And it's avoidable if we don't turn a deaf ear to the ongoing daily news of how we're destroying the environment, but take responsibility for it and not point the finger outside. But again, something practical, because if all of us are not going to do that. That's the real deal. 8 billion people will not prioritize eudaimonia over hedonia. 8 billion people will not be satisfied simply to have enough. It's not going to happen unless there's some major shakeup catalyzed by a small group of people. It could be 20, it could be 200, it could be 500. 500 great beings, 500 mahasattvas, great spiritual beings. One being, Jesus Christ, what was his impact on the planet? One human being, Buddha, one human being. What was the impact? I am persuaded that what we now need is not one person that's going to save us all. But we must become Buddhas. Even a small group of Buddhas. We must become, if we know how. And we have in the palm of the hand the means for becoming Buddhas in this lifetime. 20 Buddhas, or following the prophecies of Dujum Lingpa, received by Dujum Lingpa, the great 19th century Dzogchen master. If 100 beings achieved great transference rainbow body, became Buddhas, manifestly, 100 beings could change the whole course of human history. Not 8 billion people, because that's not going to happen. 8 billion people will not shift their priorities. The inertia is way too large. Governments will not shift their priorities. Way too much inertia. Too much stupidity, too much self-centeredness, too much hatred of others that we deem to be the wrong people. But 100 people became Buddhas? What did one Buddha do? What did one Jesus Christ do? What if there were 100? And what if we have the opportunity to be among the 100? But then we don't take advantage of it because we have other priorities. What's more important? So I ask myself, and that's my answer. I'm heading into solitude. Don't know how long I'll be there, but I know it's the best thing I can do for myself and everybody else. So let's consider what are our opportunities that hardly anybody else has and take responsibility for it.
Thank you so much, Lama Alan, for this impassioned invitation or challenge even to recognize our collective responsibility and to consider how we might participate meaningfully. And I want to thank everyone today for joining us. And I also wanted to thank the technical team that have been supporting us, Diego and David and Jude. And then also we have 3 wonderful translators, Maria, Jean and Temper, translating respectively in Spanish, Portuguese and Russian. Unfortunately, we don't have time to attend to all the questions that have been proffered, but I do want to say once again to you, Lama Alan, thank you so much for today's presentation and reflection. And perhaps you might just have a few concluding words before we end our call today.
I do. We all have the Buddha nature as potential, which simply awaits the causal conditions coming together to germinate that seed, manifest as enlightenment. Or from another perspective, as many of you know from the Dzogchen perspective, we are in reality already Buddhas, but we don't know who we actually are. to manifest our own Buddha nature, which is Dharmakaya. We need conducive environments. We need spiritual friends. As the Buddha said, having spiritual friends is the whole of the practice. But we need conducive environments as well. And so, as all of you know, I think, we now have 3 gardens that we've acquired. And one garden already has yogis that we're growing in a very protected, very nurturing environment. And they're in Crestone, Colorado. But much potential for having many more cabins and many more yogis. In Catalina, just 5 hectares, but 15 is a good start. That's how many cabins we think we can build there. In New Zealand, 590 acres. Potential for many, many cabins. If we're aspiring to reach the path, realize our own Buddha nature, our own pristine awareness, we need conducive environments. We need spiritual friends. And many, many friends of mine around the world, Dharma friends, have made it possible with these 3 properties. And hopefully there will be more, to create environments where people can realize pristine awareness, achieve rainbow body. So if this is part of your vision, if you think I've been telling you the truth here, or at least mostly truth, I'm doing my best. If you share this vision, then let's all work together to till the soil of these gardens for growing yogis. If all of us on the planet, each of us individually thinks, may I be the hope of the world. I mean, every one of us, 8 billion people, if each one of us thought, I will be the hope of the world. I will be the hope of the world. Great compassion, Mahakaruna. Then there's no doubt that we can overcome these crises. 8 billion people probably won't think that. But how about 8 million? Or how about 800,000? Or how about 8,000 that really took that seriously? I will be the hope of the world. I take upon myself the responsibility. Not upon myself as Alan Wallace with this body, not upon myself as my substrate consciousness carrying on from lifetime to lifetime, but take upon ourselves as the Buddhas that we actually are. Only the Buddha can take on that responsibility. So realize who you really are. And if we take on that responsibility with the thought, I will be the hope of the world, then there is hope for the world. So, may it be so. May we receive the blessings of the enlightened ones and of our spiritual mentors to enable us to be the hope of the world.
Thank you so much. And I know that many people will wish to offer you thanks either in the chat, they can't do so verbally, but I also wanted to say that we will be putting in the chat a link if anyone would like to offer dana to Lama Alan. That's also a possibility. So once again, Lama, thank you. And we're just so glad that you could be with us.
It's a noble topic. Thank you for reminding me. I think I've offered as much as I can for the time being. May you all be well.